The sun bore down on the vast parade ground, and the heat rippled off the concrete in waves that blurred the edges of the horizon, as if the earth itself was trembling under the weight of the day. The recruits stood shoulder to shoulder, their boots pressed firmly into the ground, and their uniforms clung to their skin, heavy with sweat and dust, and the constant reminder that weakness would not be forgiven here. The colonel walked down the line with his sharp eyes cutting into each face, searching for the slightest tremor of hesitation, and the silence of the base grew deeper with each step, because no one knew whose turn would come next, and no one wanted it to be theirs. Yet something in the air hinted that it would not be an ordinary inspection, and that something about today would not be forgotten. Each recruit tried to fix their gaze straight ahead, but the corners of their eyes burned with the need to know who the colonel would stop in front of his boots, struck the ground with a steady rhythm, a cadence of authority that echoed through the stillness and wrapped itself around the throats of the men and women standing at attention. He thrived on the tension. He thrived on watching the young soldiers stiffen with fear. When his gaze lingered too long, the colonel paused, once then moved again, as if teasing them, daring them to show nerves. The recruits knew that even a blink at the wrong moment could bring a punishment worse than physical pain, for it would mark them as unfit, before their peers and before their commander, and no one wanted to carry that stain. The colonel stopped suddenly, the sound of his boots silenced, as he stood in front of the youngest among them, a woman whose frame seemed lighter than the rest, but whose stance was just as firm. The recruits did not dare move their eyes, but every one of them felt the shift. The pause in the colonel's stride meant something. It meant the weight of his focus had landed on her. She could feel it pressing against her chest, but her gaze did not waver. Her jaw tightened, and her shoulders locked in place. She could almost hear her own heart hammering against her ribs, but she would not let it show, not when every soldier standing around her was waiting for a crack to appear in her armor, and not when the colonel's stare bore into her like fire against dry wood. The colonel leaned in slightly, his shadow stretching over her face as the sun glared down from above. His voice was low but sharp, and it cut through the air like steel sliding free of its sheath. He questioned her dedication. He questioned her resolve. He asked her in front of everyone whether she thought she belonged here, and the recruits nearby tightened their jaws, because they knew. The tone they had heard it before, and it never ended cleanly yet. She did not blink. She did not break. She held her ground in the silence while the colonel waited for even a twitch of fear, but none came, and the ground beneath them seemed to hum with the weight of what would follow. The colonel did not step back. He did not move on. He snapped his fingers and called out a command that sent a ripple through the formation. A bucket of water was brought forward, clutched tightly in the hands of another recruit, whose eyes darted nervously between the colonel and the young woman. Every soldier in the line wanted to move, wanted to turn and see, but discipline chained them in place, so they listened. Instead, they listened to the sound of boots scuffing against the ground, the slosh of water against the sides of the metal pail, and the sudden stillness that came when the bucket was set at the colonel's feet. She did not move. She did not flinch. She stood like stone as the colonel reached for the handle and lifted the weight in his hand. The recruits held their breath. The colonel raised the bucket high, and the glint of sunlight flashed across the metal rim for a brief moment, before the water cascaded downward in a heavy torrent, drenching her from head to toe. The gasp from the soldiers erupted and vanished, just as quickly choked off by the fear of being heard. Their eyes remained fixed forward, but every heart pounded with the same thought. They all wondered if she would crumble, if she would break. Beneath the humiliation, her uniform clung to her skin, the water dripping down her face and pouring onto the hot ground where it hissed against the concrete. Yet she stood tall. She did not so much as shiver under the weight of the colonel's challenge. For a heartbeat, the parade ground was not filled with soldiers. It was filled with silence, a silence so deep that even the wind seemed to stop. And in that silence, her defiance was sharper than any blade. Her stillness was a storm waiting to break. The colonel expected a reaction. He expected tears or anger or shame, but she gave him nothing. And that nothing was louder than any outburst could ever be. The soldiers around her could feel it in their bones. They could feel the weight of what was happening, though they dared not look and dared not breathe too deeply in case the colonel's wrath shifted onto them. But they knew in their hearts that something dangerous had just begun. The colonel studied her, his expression unreadable. His lips curled slightly as if waiting for her to falter, but her eyes stayed locked straight ahead, unblinking, unshaken. The sun blazed overhead, the water dripped steadily from her chin, the silence stretched on like a rope, drawn tighter and tighter until it threatened to snap, and when it snapped, something would change for everyone watching, though no one could predict what that change would bring, not yet, not until the next moment unfolded before their eyes and showed them just how far the recruit would go to stand unbroken. The colonel let the bucket fall to the ground. The sound of metal striking against concrete rang sharp across the parade ground, and the silence it left behind was heavier than the sun pressing. Down on their backs, the recruits dared not move. They dared not blink. They could only stand and feel the weight of the moment as the drenched recruit remained frozen in place, her uniform soaked and clinging to her skin, every drop of water sliding. Down her frame felt like a test, and every second of stillness felt like defiance. But no one yet knew if she would endure it, or if the colonel would press harder until even she broke. The colonel stepped closer, his boots splashing against the water. Spreading across the concrete, his eyes narrowed as he examined her as though she were a specimen on display for the entire base to see his voice cut through the air again. Sharp, commanding, asking if she thought she was strong enough to survive. His training asking if she thought she could stand among real soldiers, asking if she had the courage to wear the uniform. She now stood in soaked and heavy. The words were not just for her, they were for every recruit forced to watch, forced to listen, forced to feel the blade of humiliation sharpened against their own pride, and yet she did not answer because the rules were clear and silence was her only weapon left. Her silence only stoked the fire. The colonel smirked, then turned his head slowly, letting his eyes sweep across the line of recruits. Every soldier in formation felt his gaze scrape against them, and they all stiffened, even more afraid that the weight of his wrath might shift to them instead of her. The colonel enjoyed this power. He thrived on the sight of fear. He wanted every recruit to see that one of them had been chosen for the test, and he wanted them all to wonder if they would be next. The recruits knew that to move or even to twitch would bring disaster, but in their minds every one of them whispered the same question of whether she would endure or collapse under his hand. The colonel snapped his fingers again and barked an order. Another bucket was fetched, this time by a senior sergeant who carried it without hesitation. The sound of water sloshing against the pail echoed louder than footsteps, louder than the birds that had gone silent above, louder than the breaths of 100 recruits standing frozen in the heat when the bucket was placed before him. Again, the colonel did not hesitate. He lifted it in one swift motion, and the water cascaded over her once more, drenching her fully until not a dry inch of fabric clung to her skin. The shock of the second wave drew another gasp from the line, though quickly silenced into breathless stillness, and the recruits now wondered if he meant to break her completely in front of them all. But still, she did not move. The water rolled off her face. Her boots squelched faintly against the soaked ground beneath her, but her posture remained unbroken, her eyes fixed forward, unshaken. The colonel leaned in so close his breath carried across her drenched skin, his voice low and sharp. He told her that weakness was poison. He told her that hesitation killed soldiers. He told her that if she could not endure this, she would never endure the battlefield. And yet she did not waver. She did not drop her eyes, and the recruits around her felt the pressure build inside their chests as though they were standing on the edge of something about to collapse. The colonel straightened his back, and for a moment he simply stared at her, his smirk faltering, though not disappearing completely. He turned away as if ready to move on, but then he stopped once more and raised his voice to the entire formation. He told them that this was what happened to those who thought discipline was only words. He told them that this was what awaited anyone who dared to believe they could stand without proving their worth. He pointed at the drenched recruit still unshaken and declared her the example of what awaited weakness. His words hung heavy across the parade ground, pressing into every mind and every chest. But the recruits noticed something different, hidden beneath the surface of his voice, a flicker of something unspoken. The drenched recruit breathed steadily, her lungs tight but unbroken. She heard his words. She felt the eyes of everyone drilling into her like arrows. She knew that to falter now would mean her name would be remembered as the one who collapsed under pressure. She also knew that if she held her ground, the moment would outlive the sting of humiliation. It would outlive even the colonel's attempt to brand her as weak. So she stood, she stared. She endured the silence and the heat and the water dripping into her boots. The soldiers on either side of her wanted to look. They wanted to see her face, but they dared not. And so, they listened instead. They listened to the silence surrounding her like a shield. The colonel moved back a step, his boots ringing against the wet concrete. He raised his chin and gave the order to resume the drill, his tone sharp and final, but his eyes lingered on her longer than expected, as if testing whether her defiance would crumble after his attention shifted away. Yet she did not move. She did not let her shoulders fall. She did not let her breath break. The moment remained alive between them, a moment of tension no one could name, yet everyone could feel, and that tension promised something greater, still waiting just beyond the silence. The recruits marched, when commanded, their boots striking in rhythm across the ground, but even in motion, their thoughts remained locked on her. Every step was heavy with the memory of what they had just witnessed. Every turn of the head, every stiffened shoulder carried the shadow of her drenched frame and her unbroken stillness. And though no one dared speak it aloud, each soldier carried the same thought deep inside their minds. They all knew that something had changed today, and that whatever came next would shake them harder than anything before. The water seeped into the ground, leaving dark patches beneath her boots, while the midday sun pressed against every soldier standing on the parade ground, and still, she did not move. Her hair clung to her face, her uniform heavy as chains, yet her eyes remained fixed ahead as if the colonel himself no longer existed. The recruits around her dared not shift their gaze, but they felt the air grow tighter, the weight of her silence pressing on them more than the words of their commander had ever done. The colonel had drenched her twice and expected her to break. Yet she stood taller than before, and the unease in the ranks grew thicker with each breath. The colonel's jaw tightened, though he tried to mask it behind a smirk. He circled her slowly, his boots scraping against the wet concrete, his shadow sliding across her drenched shoulders. He stopped at her side, leaned in close, and whispered a string of words sharp enough to cut her pride. But she did not flinch. Her expression did not change, and the colonel felt the sting of defiance stronger than any shouted protest. The recruits listened to his low voice, but could not catch his words. They only heard the silence that followed her stillness, answering louder than anything she could have spoken. The colonel straightened again, and for a brief moment his smirk cracked before he caught himself. But the crack had already been seen by every soldier, even if none would dare admit it. One of the senior officers, standing off to the side, shifted his weight. The faint sound of his boots scuffing against the ground drew a flash of attention from the line, though no one moved their heads. The officer exchanged a glance with another, as if questioning silently whether the colonel had gone too far, and in that glance there was something else. A flicker of respect for the recruit who refused to be broken. Even drenched, humiliated, and tested, before the eyes of the base. The officers said nothing, but their silence carried meaning, and though the colonel felt it, he ignored it and pressed forward, unwilling to yield. The recruits whispered without words, their thoughts screaming in unison, though their mouths stayed shut. They wondered how long she could last. They wondered whether she had trained herself for such torment, or if she simply carried something inside her stronger than pain. They had seen men fall to the colonel's punishments. They had seen soldiers break in tears or rage. Yet she showed neither. She showed only stillness. And that stillness echoed through the formation like a drum that no one could silence. Every second that passed tightened the rope of tension across the ground, and everyone waited for it to snap. Then she moved, but not in the way anyone expected. Her arm lifted slowly, with precision, her palm rising to her brow in a perfect salute. The water dripping from her sleeve onto the ground, her posture unbroken, her gaze locked forward, the salute crisp as if it were the first day of inspection rather than the moment after. Public humiliation. The air froze. Every recruit, every officer, every soldier present felt their breath catch in their throats, because in that single motion she had turned the punishment into a declaration of strength. The colonel's eyes narrowed, his smirk vanished, and the base itself seemed to fall silent, waiting for what would happen next. The colonel's face hardened, the veins at his temples tight. His pride had been challenged not with words, not with rebellion, but with discipline sharper than his own orders. He wanted her to collapse, he wanted her to yield, but instead she had risen above his test and shown the formation that strength could take a different form. The silence deepened until even the sound of the distant flag whipping in the wind seemed to vanish. All that remained was the sight of the drenched recruit standing like stone with her hand raised in salute, and the unspoken knowledge that something irreversible had just happened in front of them all. The recruits felt it in their bones. They knew they had witnessed something beyond the usual cruelty of training. They knew they would remember this moment long after the day ended. Their hearts pounded, not from fear of punishment, but from the shock of watching one of their own transform humiliation into defiance and discipline. At once their jaws tightened, and their breaths grew shallow as they realized the colonel himself was being tested. Though none of them dared to show it aloud, the silence cut deeper than any shout, and it grew heavier as the seconds stretched on. The colonel exhaled slowly, his eyes still fixed on her as though trying to burn through the armor of her silence. But her gaze did not falter. Her body did not break. He turned slightly, his head angling toward the officers standing nearby as if searching for support. But none spoke. None moved, their faces locked in unreadable masks, yet their eyes told the truth. They too had seen the shift, and they too understood what it meant. The colonel was not only commanding discipline, he was now standing against a force of it embodied in the drenched recruit before him, and that force refused to bend. The wind stirred at last, carrying dust across the wet patches on the ground, and the recruits felt the moment stretching further still. The colonel had not spoken. The recruit had not moved beyond the salute, and yet the silence itself grew louder until it felt like thunder pressing against their ears. The soldiers wondered who would break the silence first, whether it would be the colonel in anger, or the recruit in surrender, or perhaps something else entirely waiting in the wings of the parade ground unseen, but ready to strike. And that uncertainty clung to the base. Like a storm cloud no one could escape. And so the moment held with her still saluting the colonel, still staring, and the recruits still frozen in disbelief, each second feeding into the next, each heartbeat pounding louder in their chests until the question of what would happen next became unbearable, and the answer waited just beyond the edge of silence. The colonel stood unmoving, his eyes fixed on the recruit still locked in her salute, the silence between them thick as steel, and the entire Formation felt it press into their chests like a weight. None could shake. The officers at the edge of the parade ground shifted but said nothing, their lips tight, their arms folded, their faces stern, but their eyes restless because they too sensed something shifting, something subtle, yet undeniable. And though the colonel's smirk had returned faintly, it did not carry the same power it once had, for the drenched recruit had stolen that power without a word, and she continued to stand unbroken before him. The sun blazed hotter, the air thick and heavy, as if the ground itself was holding its breath, waiting for what came next, and still the recruit did not lower her arm. Her salute, perfect, her frame unwavering, though her uniform was drenched, and clinging, her boots soaked and heavy, her hair dripping across her cheek. She was no longer simply a target of humiliation. She had become a pillar in the silence, and every recruit surrounding her knew it, though none dared to move their eyes. To see her clearly, they felt her presence stronger than the colonel's command, and that feeling would not leave them easily. The colonel exhaled through his nose, sharp and slow. He stepped back half a pace, his boots striking the ground with force. But the sound did not break the tension. His pride swelled and battled within him. Pride that demanded she be crushed. Pride that demanded he prove he could not be challenged. Yet another thought gnawed at him, an unwelcome thought that perhaps, breaking her now, would not bring strength but weakness to the base. For what she had shown was something no punishment could erase, and even he could not deny it, though his face remained a mask of authority. The senior sergeant, standing nearby, clenched his jaw, his eyes flicking between the colonel and the recruit, as if ready to act. Should the tension snap, the recruits in formation dared not breathe too loudly, their hearts pounding in rhythm with the silence. One wrong sound could shift the moment. And none wished to be the one who drew the colonel's wrath away from her, for all eyes had seen that she had not faltered, and if she fell now, it would not be by weakness but by force, and every soldier knew the difference, even if none could speak it aloud. The colonel's hand twitched at his side as though he considered ordering yet another test, another bucket, another humiliation. But his eyes betrayed him. His gaze lingered too long and revealed something softer. Buried behind the fire, it was not pity and it was not defeat, but it was the faintest glimmer of recognition, as though for the first time he saw not just a recruit, but a soldier forged in silence and defiance, stronger than water and stronger than pride. And though he tried to bury it quickly, the recruits who caught the flicker in his eyes would never forget it. The recruit's arm remained raised steady as stone. Her muscles burned, her shoulders ached, yet she did not yield, not for the colonel, not for the heat, not for the weight of her drenched uniform. The sweat and water stung her eyes, but she refused to blink. She knew in her core that to lower her arm now would be to give him victory, and to give him victory would undo everything. She had endured already, so she stood resolute, her heart pounding, but her spirit louder than the silence itself, and that silence was becoming a weapon of its own. The colonel shifted his gaze across the formation, his voice booming as he barked an order for the recruits to hold their ground tighter, straighter, sharper. His tone fierce, yet the soldiers heard something else hidden beneath the surface. His words lacked the sting of triumph they carried, instead the faint edge of frustration, for the focus had slipped from his grasp, and no matter how he barked or shouted, the truth could not be erased. The drenched recruit had changed the air of the base with her stillness, and every soldier could feel it, even as they obeyed his call. The recruits obeyed every command, their boots striking in unison, their bodies stiff, their gazes forward. But their thoughts not on the colonel. Their thoughts burned with the image of the drenched recruit standing alone against him, her salute unwavering, her silence louder than his voice. And in that moment they realized discipline did not belong only to the colonel. It could also belong to them if they had the courage to claim it, though none of them would dare act on the thought the seed had been planted deep within each of them, and they would never forget where it began. The colonel returned his eyes to her once more. He waited. He expected the salute to falter, to tremble, to collapse under the weight of time. But she remained like iron locked, into place. Her breath steady, her gaze fierce, her soaked uniform heavy, yet unyielding. And in that instant, he knew that he could not break her. Not without breaking the respect of the formation as well, for they had already chosen silently, they had. Chosen to believe in her strength, even if they could not admit it aloud, and if he pushed further, he risked losing their fear, and with it his grip on their hearts. The sun began to slip lower, though its heat still burned across the ground, and the colonel finally let out a breath sharp and clipped. He lowered his chin just slightly, and with a voice that carried no tremor, he gave the command to end the drill. The words struck the air like stone, yet they did not erase what had come before. The recruits obeyed their formation, breaking at last, but their eyes still drawn to her, though they dared not turn their heads, their silence followed her every step, their respect unspoken yet undeniable, and the colonel himself knew that no order, no punishment could erase what had just been carved into the spirit of the base. And as the soldiers dispersed under his command, the silence clung to the ground heavier than the heat. Heavier than the water that still pooled at their boots, and every one of them carried the same thought, the same weight, the same question of what would come next, and none of them knew how far the consequences of her defiance would reach, but they knew it would reach further than any of them could imagine. The recruits moved in silence, their boots carrying them back toward the barracks, yet their minds trapped on the parade ground where the drenched recruit had stood unbroken. Every step they took echoed with the memory of her stillness. Her salute raised against. The colonel himself and none of them could shake the image from their eyes, even though they never dared turn to see her directly. In that moment, they all felt that something within the base had changed forever, and the silence that followed them carried the weight of that change. She walked behind them, her uniform still heavy with water dripping in slow trails across the dirt. But her stride steady, her gaze locked forward, her body refusing to show the strain it had endured, though her muscles screamed within her frame. Not a single soldier around her would forget the strength she had shown, her silence louder than any words, her defiance sharper than any weapon. And even as they kept their faces straight, each one of them held her image. In the corners of their minds, a secret spark of courage they would never admit aloud. Inside the barracks, the whispers began soft. At first carried on hushed voices between bunks and fading quickly whenever footsteps of authority passed by the soldiers. Could not keep it contained. They spoke of the colonel's face when her salute refused to drop. They spoke of the way the air itself seemed to freeze when her silence cut deeper than his words. And they spoke of the unshaken strength she revealed. Even as the water poured over her shoulders, no one dared call it rebellion. No one dared call it victory. But everyone knew it was something greater than both. The officers who had stood at the edge of the parade ground gathered later in the mess. Their faces stern, but their tones quieter than usual. They, too, had felt the shift, though none dared voice it directly. They spoke instead in riddles of discipline, of endurance, of the kind of soldier who endures humiliation without breaking, and though they never named her openly, the meaning was clear to all of them. Each officer carried the same flicker of respect they had tried to bury under their hardened stares, the respect that even the colonel himself had been forced to feel, though he would never speak it aloud. The colonel sat in his quarters, his desk bare, his hands folded against the wood, his thoughts circling with the memory of her unflinching eyes. He had drenched her twice. He had pressed her under the weight of humiliation. And still she had stood, she had saluted, and in that salute she had stolen the silence from his grasp. He could punish her further, he could seek to crush her with harsher trials, but the truth gnawed at him, the truth that doing so would not prove his strength, but expose his fear. He clenched his jaw and closed his eyes, but the image of her unbroken frame lingered, refusing to leave him. Days passed. Yet the base did not forget. The story spread quietly from recruit to recruit, from unit to unit. told in fragments and pieces, each soldier adding their own breath of disbelief until the tale became larger than the event itself. Some said she had stood for an hour without moving. Others claimed the colonel had almost lowered his gaze before. Hers, each retelling, sharpened her defiance into legend, and though the truth was already powerful, the legend carried it further than the colonel's command ever could, and the silence of that day became a lesson whispered in every corner of the camp, and so the drenched recruit walked among them no longer, simply another face in formation, but a reminder of what strength looked like when stripped bare of comfort and protection. Her silence remained unbroken, her eyes steady her presence, heavy, enough that even the colonel could not erase it. The story had spread too far, the moment had carved itself into the memory of the base, and though training continued and drills resumed and orders were barked, the weight of that single defiance lingered. In every soldier's chest, a silence that haunted the base long after the water had dried and long after the colonel had left the ground in retreat.